Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a very misunderstood topic, by the way, the tariffs that the incoming Trump administration is talking about imposing. Now, there's still discussion to be had and indeed trade negotiations to be had with various countries. So this the scare campaign that Trump's going to put 10 million % tariffs and everything is just nonsense and can be dismissed out of hand. So let's come back to, we'll come back in a minute to what is being put on the table, and it hasn't fully taken shape yet. So it's probably a little bit early to get excited over the minute details. But let's look at tariffs overall and see where in the globalization project the globalists wanted to move manufacturing as much as they could lay their hands on. Certainly anything that wasn't at the most advanced value add end of the manufacturing process. They wanted to move manufacturing from the West into the third world, and whether this was initially at least in China or, I don't know, Pakistan, India, Africa, and so on, but just get it out of the first world. Now, the claim was, well, this will make everyone in the West, it'll make their standard of living higher. Well, how will it make it higher, you ask? Well, if it costs $100 to buy, for example, $100 to buy a television, say, or any consumer goods, when we use $100 as a round number, it costs $100 to buy it if it was manufactured in the West. If we take advantage of those slave labor, low cost of living rates over in some third world country, if we take advantage of that and move the manufacturing there, then the item, instead of being $100, will now be $70. So everyone's standard of living will increase. Well, how will the standard of living increase exactly? Well, the economic orthodoxy of the day was if all other points of the economy stay absolutely fixed and static and don't move, but you're able to buy consumer goods at a lower price, then by definition, your standard of living is improved. What used to cost $100 now costs $70. Thus, you have a higher standard of living and you can access more consumer goods that you hitherto couldn't access or would be too difficult to access, and so on. So this was the orthodoxy, that every other point in the economy would stay fixed, but just that now you have that cheap consumer good coming in, everybody benefits. Again, the orthodoxy of the day. And it was a lot of hogwash that was sold to us back then, around in the 1990s and going through into the later 1990s, really picking up speed in the 2000s and going off the scale after 2008-9. So what was the reality, though? Well, did standard of living actually increase or improve? And there's a few things we can look at there. So in order to send these manufacturing jobs overseas or to other cheap labor countries, millions of American workers lost their jobs. And now they would be paid, and again, I'll use round numbers here, they would be paid, say, $50,000 a year at their manufacturing job with the opportunity of overtime. Similarly, there could be more intensive technology investment in the factory, say more robots, more automation, that sort of thing. So some of the people would have lost their jobs. Typically, they would allow attrition through older workers retiring, that sort of thing. But there would be some job losses, just not very many. So it was the Western manufacturing was very high productivity manufacturing, and I'll come back to that in a minute because it's relevant. But all these people lost their jobs on $50,000 a year. But what sort of other jobs? Could they go to another manufacturing job that paid $50,000 a year? Well, they couldn't, because all the manufacturing jobs are being shifted overseas. Now, on top of that, many, not all, but many of the manufacturing jobs were in sort of regional cities, bigger towns. They weren't all in downtown New York or something. So these manufacturing jobs were in these areas where labor was generally cheaper and cost of living was generally cheap, the cost of buying houses or renting and so on. So these people lost their $50,000 a year jobs, which tended to destroy the economies in these regional towns, not just for the factory workers, but for other local shop owners, that sort of thing. But what other jobs could these people get? Well, the only jobs they could get were like working in Walmart or somewhere like that. Remember, these are relatively low skilled workers, and they don't have directly transportable skills. They can't all become top of the line, computer programmers or coders. That idea was quite absurd when it got floated years ago. So they go to much lower paid jobs. So they go from a $50,000 a year job to a $30,000 a year job. Now they've got a much lower standard of living, and then they have to claim various government benefits, food stamps, just to get by. So a lot of them have gone from no welfare going on to partial welfare payments, the working poor, as it were. And there's, again, a decimation of these regional towns and smaller cities. So what exactly has been the benefit there? Now, because these people have moved to lower paid jobs, then the tax that they pay has also declined. So the overall tax revenue has gone down from these many millions of manufacturing jobs. So, all right, now let's look at the lower quality, or let's look at the cheaper consumer goods. These tend to be lower quality, made with inferior materials, whether it be textiles or other stuff, tools that you see in the hardware stores. Again, I bought a wrench recently. It was the only wrench on the shelf that was in that size I needed, and it was cheap, and I knew it was cheap, but I only needed it for a specific task. And just using, it's a hand wrench, not an electrical one. I'm just using my weight on it to break a difficult bolt, crack the bolt. The spanner of the wrench broke. So this is the poor quality metal it's made from. It's not the metal's low quality, the annealing and everything is piss poor. So you get a much lower quality product, which you have to replace more often. So is that actually an improvement in standard of living? If there's something I can own for a lifetime or many, many years, and then I have to replace it every 5 minutes or something, are you getting a higher standard of living? Well, you're not, because the replacement cost is such that you're actually spending more than if you paid for the locally made product. Now, in terms of general consumer purchasing power, those people who are now, and again, many millions, tens of millions of Western people who are now working for $30,000 a year in salary instead of $50,000 a year, their consumer purchasing power has declined. the only money they've got left is to try and pay the rent and put food on the table. They then have fewer children, and these sorts of things. So if you look at the matrix of value and the matrix of what do you get for sending those factories overseas, you get a much lower return overall. And you'd think that the social justice warriors that drive themselves insane over LGBTQ issues, you think this would be something that would get them excited as well, but they don't seem to care about it, strangely. They're far more concerned with giving puberty blockers to teenagers. They are about millions of people moving from $50,000 a year to $30,000 a year jobs, maybe because it's mainly straight white males that are suffering. So maybe that's an issue that they can rejoice over rather than commiserate. Now, coming to the issue of productivity. Now, this is something I know quite a lot about because I was involved with reviewing, international factories in third world countries. I had a job at one stage doing that. And so I'll give you some idea to the difference. And this is the productivity equation I'm going to talk about now. So the factory that, for example, the factory that did, pulping wood into paper and creating paper products and cardboard cartons and, that sort of stuff. So now in Australia, the factory, but no, I'll round off numbers here to illustrate the point. The factory produces 100 tons of paper a day, say. And to do this, they need 250 workers. Now, there's a lot of, it's a big factory, there's a lot of robotization and automation but also a lot of care over environmental things, treating the wastage and chemically treating it and properly disposing of it, these sorts of things. The jobs pay passably well. I mean, they're not big ticket jobs or anything, but they pay passably well. And the people that work there have a decent standard of living. The company provides quite good, subsidised food and so on. So that people can buy cheap lunches and breakfasts there, that type of thing. It's probably for a lot of people, lower, medium maybe in the technician's case, but generally lower skilled people. It's a pretty good job to have. So they've got 250 people producing 100 tonnes a day. Again, a lot of automation. Now, a factory in a third world country where the average wages are like 1/10, less than 1/10 of what they are in Australia. This factory, they've got 3,000 instead of 250. They've got 3,000 workers, and there's not a machine inside because labour is so cheap and so expendable. Why would you automate? Why would you spend money on plant and equipment? And given that the government of these third world countries want as many people in employment as is possible, then they tend to discourage technology and automation, and again try and encourage this mass employment. That's horribly inefficient. So they instead of producing 100 tonnes a day, these guys produce 90 tonnes a day with 12 times as many workers. So the productivity differential is huge. If you look at the difference, it's around 25 times difference in productivity between the Western factory and the third world factory, given the amount of people. Now, when you rejig the equation for the differential in wages, because these people are paid pittance slave labour wages compared to the Western one, when you readjust for the economics of it all, as in the arbitrage of the wage differential, then the productivity difference, including again the wage differential, is now 6 to 8 times. So it falls from 25 times in raw productivity per person to 6 to 8 times in terms of funds employed. So the globalist architecture of moving things around is, what is your return on funds employed given the labour is so cheap? But in order to realise that equation, sending Western factories overseas, they have to rely on certain control of the governments, these third world governments, so that they will artificially jig the exchange rates and things like that. They won't allow free floating, or they'll juice up the exchange rates. They'll prevent unions or any organisation of labour, and the government, third world government, will permit disgorging vast amounts of pollutants into the water systems and things like that. They won't bother treating them. They've got much cheaper coal-fired electricity in those places, while the West is going on this absurd, insane green bullshit. So there are these offsetting factors. But again, the productivity differential is 6 to 8 times when you adjust for wage arbitrage and associated arbitrage, such as that they've got coal-fired cheaper power and things like that, environmental issues and so on. So what were tariffs achieve? Well, remember, the globalist trading system is artificial in itself. Instead of calling it tariffs, they rig and fix and exploit slave peasant labour, exploit jigged and juiced up exchange rates, exploit slack environmental controls, and they exploit all that and force it on. So the requirement of us opening a factory here is that you do this, and that type of thing. So it's already it's tantamount equivalent to the effect of having tariffs and so on. Now, in addition to this, places like China, there are various backdoor government subsidies that go to exporters. And these aren't an upfront declaration of controlling or influencing international trade, but they're every bit as equal to it, even though they're giving subsidies through the back door, whereas the Trump administration is thinking of putting tariffs on the front end of the transaction. So it's very clear and it's out there. Whereas there's a huge amount of subsidies, whether it's money coming in through the United Nations or it doesn't matter, but there's vast sums of money through the back door that we don't see or hear about, which artificially cheapen the goods that are being manufactured in these third world countries. So what do the tariffs achieve then? Well, the tariffs really recompensate for the artificial influencing that the globalists have instilled and installed and entrenched in the international trading system. This idea of free trade they keep on talking about is bullshit. It's not free trade at all. It's globalist juiced up trade, which militates against jobs in Western economies. So the tariffs on foreign-made goods are not it's not preventing trade from occurring, as some of the hysterics are claiming. Far from it. If an American firm or a Western firm has sent jobs overseas, and I'll come back to a few examples in a minute, but sent jobs overseas to a third world country or a cheap labour country, whether it's a lower middle grade economy or a third world economy, if it's sent jobs over there, then the tariffs come on, and they've then got to make an economic decision. Well, given these tariffs, why don't we manufacture these products, whatever the products may be? It could be, again, textiles, I don't know, footwear, or electronics, or whatever. Motor vehicles. Let's manufacture these products in the United States, and let's make the most efficient, manufacturing operation in the world. Here's a chance for us to really go back to the drawing board. Let's have lots of automation, lots of robots, and sure, that there'll be intense automation, and why not? But through that, secondary jobs are created, such as the manufacturing those advanced, lathes and robots. Many of those things will be manufactured in the US at the higher end of the value. So there's a boom in that. Then there's a boom in the maintenance technicians and support, engineers and so on. There's a boom in design engineers. Well, how can we improve on this design? All that sort of stuff then happens in America, in the United States, or at very least in the West generally. So there's a virtuous sort of flow-on effect of this. Now, these factories that made 20 years ago have employed, again, using round numbers, employed 100 people. Maybe they employ 50 people today because of the more intensive use of technology in the manufacturing process. But that's fine. The jobs are coming back. And the idea, and particularly if the Trump team insists on, we'll give you tariff protection, but you've got to produce quality goods at a world competitive price. That's the deal. You're not prepared to do that, then no tariffs for you, buddy, or dialogue to that effect at least. So all these jobs will come back. All these factories will come, because it'll make an economic sense to do so. But once they've got that incentive to do that, and I would also suggest that the Trump team consider about increased rates of write-down. So if they're buying expensive things like robots or other forms of automation, that they get accelerated write-down. So instead of maybe depreciating it over several years, they're able to depreciate over 1 or 2 years. Things like that. Let's create some real incentives here. We want the very best factories producing the best quality goods at a world competitive price. Let's make sure that happens. Let's add the assistance, not to be exploited by sleazy goons, but in Wall Street or something, but to be there, because as well as creating jobs, it's if you want to be into social justice, this is my take on it. Creating well-paid jobs in America is one of the best ways. Absolutely, without question, one of the best ways or the West generally, of providing social justice to the economy, the society, the country, the community, the town, the city, the whatever. That's one of the best ways to do it. Creating lots of these relatively, at least, well-paid jobs, and again producing quality goods for other Americans to buy. Also, there's nothing stopping those companies from exporting. If it's a great quality product manufactured at a very efficient manufacturing at a good price, why can't they export it? And maybe there should be assistance and grants to consider some of that. And it would completely reorder the world trade away from the globalization model, which is I believe is very destructive into one that's extremely virtuous. Now, there are those that say, well, the third world country, what about them? But they're basket cases anyway. Now, should they be helped with United Nations assistance, and should they be helped to build roads and bridges and put I don't know, dams in there? Should that still? Of course, it should still go on. There should still be help through those channels, World Bank or whatever, to help those third world impoverished countries improve their life. Nothing wrong with that at all, and that should continue. But it should not be at the expense, the direct expense of the Western citizens, that they should have low-paid, shitty jobs just to facilitate, these corrupt tin pot dictatorships in the third world, where the improvements in their standard of living, the improvements in their economy is patchy at best and richly rewards an corrupt elite class, still at the expense of the people at the bottom. So it's hardly a significant achievement from any social justice perspective. I wanted to just close with talking about, certainly that I'm aware of, factories, or some of the factories I'm aware of rather, in Australia, where they closed down needlessly and sent jobs offshore. So as soon as they find it a little bit difficult or complicated, the management, this is a little bit difficult or complicated, or it's all too hard, rather than take the hard decisions, and they're not getting really government support. In fact, the globalist controlled governments are really encouraging these companies to send their work offshore rather than encouraging them to stay. So just looking at one factory, this was making footwear, looking at one factory some years ago that ended up sending the work off to China, the factory off to China. They had a lot of old plant and equipment, and they had a very successful brand. So they owned the brand, and it was a well-known sort of household brand, really. But the factory they had, which was in a regional town, so that they weren't wearing the full sort of brunt, if you like, of high city type wages. Real estate in the area was cheap, rent was cheap, so they could afford to pay less than the average wage and still provide a pretty decent quality of life to their local workforce, which was, I think 800 or 900 or somewhere in that vicinity. But they had the factory had been put together. If you wanted to promote inefficiency, you would put it together like that. In areas where there should have been automation, there was none. Where there was automation, it was wrongly and very badly sequenced. The quality control was piss poor. The family that had owned it had appointed all their buddies and friends and hangers-on and mistresses and all that sort of stuff. So it was outrageously inefficient. And so a bank, a financial institution, who again was a globalist stooge institution, so what you guys do, to send it off to China. Don't worry about fixing things up. I mean, now they did bring in a manufacturing consultant who I knew. That's how I got involved in this. And he looked and said, look, this is the most inefficient factory layout sort of you can imagine. But if you do this, and this, and put these new machines in, so on and so forth, then the business, the factory will be quite profitable, and you can keep going in Australia. You don't need to go overseas. The bank effectively poo-pooed this and said, look, we're not going to give you any extended credit or anything like that if you don't do what we want. And what we want you to do is send the manufacturing overseas. So there's a lot of forces sort of conspiring to send the factory overseas, and that needs to be recognised. They may have decided to stay, but they also took other decisions. So what if we automate on the way this manufacturing consultant said, instead of 900 workers, we'll only have 550, for example, and we don't want to, we know all these people, we don't want to look them in the face and be responsible for them losing their jobs, retrenchments and so on. Nor do we want to have to pay retrenchment packages out, and this sort of stuff. And the bank wouldn't agree to paying retrenchment packages. So there were those issues were also factored in. So they considered just easier around the politics of it, the social politics, the economics, the bank pushing them. They said, screw it, we'll just close down and send the whole thing overseas, then we can blame the Chinese and blame unseen abstract forces for what happened, rather than saying it was a decision that we made to lay a few people off, or a few hundred people off in this case. So they just closed down and shipped it all off. Now, they still own the brand, and they still own the, if you like, the distribution network in Australia. But it's now manufactured in China. Now, the quality of the goods has gone downhill substantially. So much lower quality product, and a much lower, I believe, like it's a lower price. No, say again, using round numbers, it's $100. It's now $85 or something like that. But you're getting a lower quality product that it's not as comfortable as they once were. There's the quality control's piss poor and this sort of thing. So what's the benefit been? There hasn't been. But if you look at the forces conspiring, lazy, incompetent management, financial institutions egging them on and encouraging them to send the stuff offshore, but management that don't suffer the pain themselves. The management that was lazy and incompetent and sent the stuff offshore, they're still in place. They're still there, and they're still putting their very substantial salaries in their pockets, and so they're okay. But this is, if you look at the wider issue here, that factory didn't need to go overseas. It could have stayed and could have been a productive factory in Australia, still employing many hundreds of Australians. And this is really the story that goes all around the Western world. So in conclusion, I believe, certainly what I've seen of the Trump team platform in this area, that these tariffs that President Trump's talking about, again, if they're applied properly, will be wonderful for the American economy. And we can only hope it leads to the dismantling of the stacked and rigged globalist trading system, and brings these jobs back to the West. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.